Now we're going to talk a little bit about fall rye. So we've got some, the group here from FP Genetics as well that can probably fill you on more information about the crop as well. What we have here is we've got a fall rye agronomy project here where basically we are comparing open pollinated and hybrid lines. So obviously hybrid varieties have moved into Canada now. There's now I think 3 that are registered. But anyways, also we wanted to take a look at how they do under kind of conventional or I guess less managed conditions versus kind of intensive management, so higher amounts of nitrogen and fungicide treatment, better weed control. Anyway, so yeah, we can walk through this stuff, but I guess the biggest thing to kind of understand here is that Gatino and Brasetto are the hybrid lines that are in this trial, and then AC Rifle, which is a semi-dwarf variety, it's an open pollinated variety, and then Hazelet is kind of, I guess, the most widely grown open pollinated line in Western Canada. So you can kind of see some of the big differences. For me, I mean, I've looked at this stuff for quite a few years in a row now. The biggest things that typically stand out for me in terms of differences between open pollinated and hybrid are typically that well, there is a difference. Short of AC Rifle, the open pollinated lines are typically taller. The hybrid lines typically are short, a lot more uniform. Certainly what we've seen, and there's no denying this, is that the hybrids, the yield is higher. So anywhere between 15 to 25 to maybe even 30% higher yielding than the open pollinated lines. So we knew that going into this. When we decided to go to this intensive versus conventional management system, what we wanted to do is we wanted to basically pull apart the yield components as well to try to understand where the yield is coming from. So when we did that, it was quite interesting. Some of you may have been at the conference, the Farming Smarter conference back in October, where I kind of laid out the data. But the interesting thing, the primary yield gain or heterotic effect in rye is based on head size. So what we found typically was that there was about 8 or 9 more kernels per head in the hybrid than the open pollinated line. So that was quite fascinating. The other thing, and what they see in the literature typically, is that the seed size for the hybrid is also a little bit larger. That was not the largest effect in all this. Like again, as I said, the size of the head was a big thing. Tillering certainly is also a component of heterosis. That also, there was an increase in that case. But once again, going back to it's the head size that really matters, okay? So that's the biggest thing I think that you can understand from that. When we compared the intensive versus the conventional management strategies, what we found was that nitrogen makes a big difference, okay? So that's not new news, okay? So the crop tillered more and everything like that. What we did find, which was a little bit concerning in sites where you had moisture and things like that, or higher levels of moisture, certainly at flowering, but also later, is that this extra amount of nitrogen seemed to make the crop tiller more, and as a result, it stretched out the flowering period, and we had significantly more ergot in the rye crop. So that's both the hybrids and the open pollinated lines saw an increase in ergot. So that is presenting, I guess, a bit of a conundrum. So with these hybrids, they can yield an amazing amount of grain, as well as open pollinated rye can yield an amazing amount of grain as well, right? So we saw at Lethbridge, I think we saw in the hybrids, the average was about 170 bushels per acre. The open pollinated lines were in about the 135 to 140 bushels per acre. So they could yield really well. But as I said, you know, so that gives you the idea, okay, well, let's go after it. Let's really kind of push things from a yield perspective. There is the drawback of potentially having more ergot in the crop. So that is a concern. It's something that we need to work on. I know certainly FP Genetics is sponsoring some work in agronomy to try to look at seeding rates and things like that to try to get around that. Because typically, my understanding, and they can speak to this trial was seeded at 250 seeds per meter squared. So that's that's close to a bushel per acre. Typically, the hybrids are seeded at about 175 or so, right? I think that's kind of the idea, so 0.8 of a unit. When you seed at lower rates. Obviously the crop tillers more, so you're taking advantage of that, but that also can stretch out the flowering period, and that could be where you're not getting this big pulse of pollen. You're getting florets that maybe haven't been fertilized. Because we have so many good grasses here, and depending on how the rains come in, but typically we get nice amounts of rain when this stuff starts to head out, that you get that perfect cocktail for ergot production. And so there's some challenges that we need to overcome. Some things maybe, so 2 options off the top of my head is seeding rate. So we'd like to do a little bit more work on that and try to understand, you know, how high do you have to go to and is there any difference? The other thing is fertility levels. So it's not necessarily starving the crop of nitrogen. Perhaps it might be timing, but not really going to the point that it's much higher than anything that you would do. Certainly a later application in rye. In cereals, typically most of the nitrogen you want to get into them for yield is kind of at or before heading, definitely. In rye, you don't care about protein, you're not paid for that, so you don't necessarily want to put in a nitrogen application later on. So getting it on early so that tillering the crop can get it into it, and away it goes, and then essentially there's not a lot of excess nitrogen around that could encourage tillering maybe later on if you get some moisture at that time. So that's really it. You guys can kind of walk through the plots. I think essentially, you know, we typically saw increased yield in the intensive management than conventional, depended on the location. But that's typically what we saw. We also I did a budget for that, and I didn't present that at the Farming Smarter. The interesting thing is that, yeah, you can make money on rye if you put into the budget sheet that I got from the province. You know, and the yields we got and the management, certainly compared to the other crops on that, it paid a lot of bills. And this was at actually rates that, I guess, prices per bushel that you're marketing the grain at that were lower that I heard from a lot of people that were marketing their grain. So that was for feed, and then that was for for milling, but for the price that they were offering out of Lethbridge here. So certainly you can do quite well by it. Yeah, I think that's it. I don't know if anybody has any questions or comments about things.
The point, the hybrid rye does have get you into that milling market better if you want to speak to that.
Yes, absolutely. So falling numbers really is the main, I mean, obviously how clean the grain is and making sure it grades #1, but certainly Gatineau and Brisetto have much higher falling numbers, so typically 100 seconds or more better than the OP line, so they put a real emphasis on that. And so that kind of is, I guess, a level of assurance that you should be able to make the milling, you know, the milling grade. The other important thing I should actually add to that, that's not an excuse to leave the crop sit out in the field. So we had trials run with FP Genetics and Ducks Unlimited, and so farmers got 20 acres of seed. They compared Hazlet and Brisetto side by side. And what we saw in some of those cases, that yeah, it was probably a smaller field, but the actual crop was left in the field for longer than a year. And so if you want to get that, you can't treat rye like rye. This is an important thing to kind of understand. Treat it like a high value crop. Treat it like you would your durum wheat or your winter wheat or your spring wheat. And that's where you'll actually gain the advantage in terms of marketing and things like that. So, yeah. Anything else?
I was just wondering if you would go frolic in the fall rye for us a little. I'm just kidding.
I do that every day, Ken, so why would I do it?
That's why
now?
you're in it, eh?
Yeah.
It looks amazing out here this year compared to the winter wheat. So we actually will probably take a coffee break to get people energized and forget about how pretty this looks. And then we'll end off with Rob Graff. But I do have a question regarding rotations. Like, especially out in this neck of the woods, you got fall rye in there, you harvest it off earlier. What are the options as far as following up with another winter cereal? Is that a bad idea? Is it,
well, you know,
if we did, what type would you?
Well, I wouldn't follow it with a cereal for sure. I mean, some of the comments, I mean, so we don't typically crop right on top of our stuff after, and so really my knowledge of volunteers in our stuff, I don't really have it. but certainly in talking to growers like Andy, who's grown a lot of rye, and then some other people, is that it can volunteer. And so it should always follow with something that you can kind of clean that up. Okay, so just think about that. Some of the comments I have from farmers is they'll follow with canola, something that's Roundup ready. They can clean stuff out of that. You know, anything other than a cereal, I guess. So.
Speaking of canola, Jamie, can you speak to allelopathy?
Yeah, so
there's some misconceptions and
yeah,
how much
so
there is.
yes, yeah, that's a big thing. So there's some, I guess there was some talk by some people that you got to worry about allelopathy in rye, and certainly I think it's, in my opinion, it's something you should embrace. Okay, you should use it to your advantage. People think that the lingering effects are quite long. The research that I've seen is that initially at seeding, the roots exude basically allelopathic chemicals that kind of in some ways keep some of the weed seeds around from germinating. So take advantage of that. Then the crop gets growing quite, and then it becomes quite competitive, I should say. So typically what you see, and this is, you can almost say for winter cereals in general, because it gets competitive, it outcompetes the weeds throughout the crop and then following the crop. So sometimes what they did find is that there is some allelopathic chemicals in the straw once you take it off, but that effect is very fleeting, okay? So it typically lasts 2 or 3 weeks and it's gone. Most of this comes from the roots. Typically when they survey varieties, if it has allelopathic effects, they look at it at the seedling stage. That's the best way to look at it. So, yeah, I think that's essentially it. I don't think it's as much of a concern as people think it might be. So, yeah.
So no problem with going with like a pea rye rotation or a pea lentil?
Well, it'd be nice. Yeah, I mean, it'd be nice to lengthen that out a bit. But yeah, no, I don't see an issue at all. You know, like, so for instance, if you look at, so the big thing right now in certainly Eastern Canada and the US is cover cropping. What's the major crop that you use in cover cropping? It's rye, okay? What these people are doing is they're growing rye up to about this stage, they roll it, they don't even kill it, they roll it, and they go into soybeans or corn after that, and they're seeing no effect, right? So it's kind of, initially at the seeding stage, there might be effect, they roll it down, and they're not seeing an effect for corn and soybeans. You know, so it may be that those crops aren't affected at all. That could be one option, or just that, you know, it's not something to really be concerned about. So would I roll rye and put canola into it? I don't know if I do that, but and to be honest with you, the other way is that we don't really have the research on all that either to say that it is a good idea or not. And so that's the thing with rye. Like, as I dig in further, there are huge holes in our knowledge about the crop. Huge holes. Fungicide timing. Huge holes. Right? So some of this needs to be rectified and, you know, and work towards it. So
I'm going to ask you a question for discussion. You say use fungicide. So in rye, your yield on the flag leaf is only about 10% compared to in cereals. We're talking 35-40% of your yield comes from the health of the flag leaf.
yeah. I'm talking in terms of Fusarium head blight specifically.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, no.
You know a hell of a lot more than I do, and I just wondered where you're going with that.
Yeah, so I mean, when are you supposed to apply a fungicide to rye to control Fusarium head blight? When do you do it? What's optimum timing?
Similar to durum or wheat, not?
No? Well, so when does Fusarium infect the head? What's the timing of that? It heads out, so I want you to watch. If you guys have a rye at home, if it's just heading out, tell me how long it takes for it to go to anthesis after it heads out. 7 to 14 days. So you spray a fungicide on it at heading, you're missing, right? So we don't have that information. It may be that it is fine, you know, at heading, but odds are it's probably when flowering occurs, right? This is what the logic is. And so the key is then to get that fungicide timing at the right thing. So there's huge holes. We haven't done the research on that.
So
You know?
any benefit to fungicide in it flowering? You don't get a benefit?
We'll see. We don't know.
How
We don't-
susceptible-
or ergot infection after that. You know, if you spray it flowering, is it causing damage to the florets, and then you're going to get ergot production? We don't know. So there's holes, like I'm saying, and so this work needs to be done, to be honest with you. And it's low-hanging fruit, right? We've got fusarium nurseries and all the capabilities to do this stuff. It just needs to be done. Yeah.
Is the fall rye highly susceptible to head blight, or how
So
does it rank there?
yeah, so
I don't know.
no, I've looked into this a bit, and so typically what they see in Germany is that in terms of infection, it's similar to maybe just below, okay? But what, of wheat, sorry, of winter wheat. But what they see is that the DON levels, deoxynivalenol, is actually quite a bit lower, which is an interesting thing. So once again, we need to evaluate that on a Canadian environmental basis. We expect that to be similar, but we don't necessarily know because we haven't really done that here. We know very little about fusarium head blight in rye.
Plus, the flowering is so much earlier than winter wheat that environmentally.
Well, you know, it's interesting, Andy. You're right. But, you know, typically what you see is rye head out and then winter wheats later. But what you'll see is actually anthesis in the winter wheat and the rye when they're seeded at the same time is not that much different, believe it or not. It heads out, and so that gives you the illusion that it's early. But it isn't actually that early. You look at maturity and, you know, and Rob's stuff, because his group did it, so it's them measuring maturity. From the fall rye co-op, it was either plus or minus a day or two in rye and winter wheat. And they were going, the trials are beside each other, planted the same day, same people doing the notes, right? I think it's about as good as an example of how you can kind of see that it gives you the illusion it's early. Yes, it heads out early, but anthesis matters. That's when it fills the grain.
I think it's earlier than that.
Yeah, that's a whole other kettle of fish there. Yeah, absolutely. So
on the trials, what was the fertility here?
So yeah, so the conventional, we just had 60 pounds of nitrogen put on in the spring. And then on the intensive, we did 50 in the fall and then 100 in the spring. So we were trying to push it a little bit just to try to see what the maximum yield potential of some of this stuff is. So.
Just quickly back to the fusarium. Is the same fusarium species that's affecting wheat also impacting rye?
We expect that to be yes, but we're gonna, the plan is to test that, yep. But we're gonna test, you know, several species of fusarium to try to know if there's any difference and things like that. So the person that would be doing that work is Anita Bruley-Babel, who's at Manitoba.
If there was a species difference, that would make sense why the DON levels were lower in the rye, right?
Certainly, yep.
Right.
Yep, but what they did in Germany, I mean, it was evaluated head to head. If it is a species issue, that's true, but we should get to the bottom of this through the proposed research that we have. So yeah, that's a great question and a really good point. Yeah.
So would you recommend hybrid rye on irrigation?
I think you'd be crazy not to. You know, irrigation timing is crazy, but if you can line up a market for this stuff to grow it on irrigation, like what we saw from a yield perspective was unbelievable. I mean, when we did the math, what we saw was that the hybrid rye, you were basically making about $500 an acre based on the prices that we had and the budget that we put together. So to me, that seems decent. So yeah, because of the yield potential and things like that, yeah.
Maypig was gross revenue, or is that?
That was net, actually. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Jamie. Maybe let's take a few minutes to take a look at Jamie's plots. There is